Beginning of this, so I hope I don't run us over, but I did want to share something. So I'm going to start with sharing my screen. And I wanted to talk about a recent find that takes us back to the first week of our, oh, and I'm going to turn, oh shoot, I always do this every time. Let me stop sharing for a minute. Turn off this darn camera. There, okay. I want to talk about a recent find that just came up that I wanted to share with you that takes us back to our first week of class. So, very recently, just right off the press a couple days ago, archaeologists in London discovered a fully preserved wooden funerary bed. It was the first of its kind ever found in Britain, dates back to the Roman period. It was found in an ancient Roman cemetery near the Holborn Viaduct, so in central London, near the city of London. And they also found 5 wooden coffins, oak coffins. So I wanted to show you, actually before this excavation, only 3 Roman wooden coffins had ever been found in London. So this was unprecedented. And usually you don't find wooden remains from this time period. Normally the wood would decay, it would break down. But where these were found was near the old Fleet River. Remember, I talked about London having more than one river. So it was found in the damp mud where the Fleet River would have been. So they were very remarkably well preserved, unusually. We know that the bed is made from a very high quality oak. It has carved legs and feet. It has joints that are fixed together with wooden pegs. It's about 6 feet long. And archaeologists think that it was probably taken apart, sort of almost like a flat pack, like IKEA. If you go to IKEA and buy a bed from IKEA, it was kind of taken apart, laid flat, probably it was found in the grave of an adult male who they think was in his late 20s, early 30s when he died. And because the bed is so fancy, they said this would have been a person of high status. So I wanted to show you, here is the bed being excavated. And at the top here is what they think the bed, just an artist rendition of what they think the bed would have looked like. Now, there are other grave sites and actually gravestones found across the Roman Empire, and they show scenes of dead people kind of sitting or reclining on couches, and sometimes even eating, like they're still alive. That's how they're depicted. So this indicates that this bed may have been a grave good, if you will, something that was intended to be used in the afterlife. So they would bury people with vessels and things that they thought in the afterlife, you're going to need these. So the bed may have been that. They're not sure. They said it was very carefully taken apart and stashed, just like IKEA furniture. And the practice of being buried on beds was believed to have been popularized at the beginning of Christianity, the introduction of Christianity. And you would often see these depictions or re-depictions of large, especially high status individuals being carried on beds in funeral processions. But until now, there's been really no evidence that Romans in Britain were buried with beds. So this is the first time that they have seen this. And they also found some artifacts. So along with the bed, they found, in these coffins, they found some glass and bone beads, a vial. And this one was interesting. This is a decorated lamp. They think it dates to AD 40 to 80, so a long time ago. So they think, okay, this cemetery then was founded at the beginning of the Roman occupation. But the lamp is interesting because it depicts, it's hard to tell from here, but it depicts the design of a defeated gladiator. And that's another sign of a funeral. The gladiator has been defeated, the gladiator is dying. So that was an interesting find of theirs, and very well intact, as you can see. And then these are the coffins that they were digging up. And finally, because London is layer upon layer upon layer of history, as we've been talking over the last few weeks, they also found a couple of other remains in here. On the left is a timber-lined well dating back to the 13th century. So they think this may have been from a medieval tannery. And then on the right is a 16th century water pipe that they found under there as well. So I just wanted to share that with you. Nothing to do with Georgian London, but I thought it was very interesting. History, we continue every day to discover more and learn more. So wanted to cover that. And now I'm going to go to the Georgians, which is what we are talking about today. So let's start with the Georgians. Okay, so This is going to be a little different. The last few weeks, we've been talking a lot about wars and plagues and really kind of stuff that wasn't all that cheery all the time, rebellions. This week, we are going to be looking at Georgian London. This is the time period from 1714 to 1835. It was a time of great change, just unparalleled physical and social transformation for London. London became a megacity, a really burgeoning metropolis, lots of societal change. So this one's not quite as heavy as some of the other ones have been. Oops, you don't want to do that. Okay. So we're going to be looking at the growth of housing, suburban growth. We see great mansions being built, new parks, grand squares, public buildings like hospitals and museums and government buildings, and palaces like Buckingham Palace and Kensington Palace were built during this time period. This was also a time period when we see advancements in transit infrastructure. So paved roads, new and renovated bridges, the railway lines come in, huge impact on London. And finally, and probably most importantly, it was the era that heralded in the Industrial Revolution. So a switch from an agrarian society to manufacturing, and that was huge. All right, just a short reminder, if you haven't already done so, please mute your microphones. So the agenda today is we are going to look at the Industrial Revolution. We're going to talk about culture and society. We're going to look at some civil engineering, and as always, we will look at some architecture as well. So before we do that, very quickly again, I don't spend a lot of time on these monarchs, and I did a whole talk on the Stuarts that you can find, and the Georgians for that matter, that you can find on the Love Loving at Home YouTube channel if you're interested. But the last Stuart monarch that we spoke of last week was Charles II. Remember, he's the one that came back out of exile in 1666 with the restoration of the monarchy after his father had been executed. Charles had many illegitimate children, but he didn't have any legitimate heirs. So when he died in 1685, he was succeeded by the man on the left here, his brother, James II. James was a very devout Catholic.
Deb,
Yep.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but we're still looking at the other finds
You are.
picture.
Uh-oh. All right,
At least I am.
You are. Okay, let me get rid of this. Thank you for letting me know that. All right, let me stop sharing and share again. And let me see if that makes a difference. Why did that happen?
I don't know if anybody else was seeing that too, but
No,
yeah.
everybody should have been seeing it if you were seeing it. Okay,
Yeah.
let me start again. I'll just start where we are right now. Let me go back down to my Zoom. Share my screen again. All right, let me know.
There we are.
Okay, great.
It's
okay,
good.
you didn't miss anything the first couple of slides. There were just some pictures. Okay, so the Stuarts. This guy on the left, James II, he becomes king in 1685. He's a very devout Catholic. And when he came to the throne, he said, look, I'm not going to change anything. My religious beliefs are not going to affect how the country is run, because remember, the Catholics weren't all that well loved. But this didn't really prove to be the case totally. So James did begin to replace many men of power that were not Catholic. And he also began allowing Catholics to hold offices, even the armed forces. He started using them as his advisors on his council. And in 1687, he passed the
What's that?
Hello? Everything okay? He passed the Declaration of Indulgence Act. And what that did was it removed all laws against the right of Catholics. And people didn't like this. In fact, 7 leading bishops refused the king's order to read this declaration in church, and they were arrested for what they considered their rebellion against the king. So the king wasn't totally popular. Now, he had 2 daughters by his first marriage, Mary and Anne. But when he remarried, after his first wife died and he remarried, his second wife produced a son and heir. And this really worried the Protestants at this point, and the Anglicans. They were really worried that, we feel like we're getting suppressed here. We're worried now this guy has a male heir. This is going to be the start of a really robust Roman Catholic dynasty, which we don't want to see here. So they felt, okay, it's clear James has to go. But this time, unlike the fate of his grandfather, Charles I, it was in a pretty much bloodless revolution. So what happened was, I mentioned that James had these two daughters. So Parliament turned to William of Orange, the guy in the middle here. He was a Dutch Protestant, and he had married King James's daughter, Mary. And they were actually first cousins. Mary and William were first cousins because William's mother was a daughter of Charles I. So they were very closely related. And William was encouraged to come over and invade England. Twice they said, come on over, help us kick this guy out, James out. But he refused. But the third time around, he said, okay, yeah, I'll come over. And he brought a large force with him in November of 1688. Very minor, no major battles. It was a very short skirmishes, very few casualties. And King James's regime basically collapsed. He fled the country with his wife, with his son. And thereafter, William became William III of England, but he ruled alongside his wife jointly. So she was not a queen consort. She wasn't just the king's wife. Because she was James's daughter, she was also a reigning queen in her own right. So now you had a king and queen reigning jointly together. So William and Mary. So they ruled together. Mary died a few years later. Again, no children. William continued to rule on his own until he died in 1702, and then the crown passed to Mary's sister, Anne. And she died herself, although she had many, many children, none lived to adulthood. She had many pregnancies, many miscarriages, stillbirths. Finally, she died in 1707 without an heir. The exiled son of James II, James Edward, he tried to make a comeback. He tried to regain the throne for the Stuarts, but didn't take. His own two sons also tried. That didn't work out. So now that's the end of the Stuarts. We have no Stuarts. So that leads us to where we are now, the Georgians, also called the Hanoverians, because they were the electors of Hanover in Germany. But this period gets its name from the first four Georgian monarchs, which you see here, George the First, Second, Third, and Fourth, not very inventive with their names. So when Queen Anne died without an heir, the crown passed to her German second cousin, George Louis of Hanover. On the left here, he became George the First. How did he get here? His mother was a granddaughter of James I, that very first Stuart king. So that was his link to the British throne. That's all I'm going to say about the Georgian monarchs at this point. Again, there's a whole talk on them if you want to go find it on the Love, Living, and Home channel. So let's, though, move on now to London. I mentioned the Industrial Revolution. This began around 1760, and it lasted until around 1840. And it really changed the world. It was transformational. This was the coming of mechanized production. So again, it marked this shift from a mostly agrarian society to a technological one. The scale of Britain's industrial expansion, especially during the latter part of the 18th century into the 19th century, it was enormous and it was absolutely unprecedented. Britain led the world in the development of rail networks, steamships, and London itself really soon became the largest industrial center in Europe. You saw industries like food and drink. These were very important industries. So you started seeing flour mills cropping up and sugar refineries and breweries, that kind of thing, all scattered all over London. And in fact, except for churches, the sugar refineries of Georgia and London were the tallest buildings in the capital at that time. Now, you also saw this establishment of really vast complexes of docks in the East End, particularly after about 1800. And then you also saw cropping up in the East End new refineries, and they were known as sugar houses in their time, and they grew up all over East London as well. London was also really well known for the manufacturing of textiles during this time, and this was due in part because of the arrival of a large number of Huguenot silk weavers who came into London, and we're going to talk about them a little bit later. So you're seeing all of this, you're seeing the expansion of the British Empire. There was a rapid increase in international trade because of the expansion, so East and West Indies, North America, shipyards cropping up all over the place in London because of this. And then finally, the other thing that came out of some of this was you're seeing a growing merchant class. You're seeing a more prosperous middle class. And that led to a bigger demand for consumer goods. They had more disposable income. They wanted to spend money on more luxury goods, not just the bare necessities that they needed. This was an opportunity with the Industrial Revolution for more jobs, right, in London. And this brought in a population migration from the country to urban areas. Again, as we've seen almost every week, an explosion in populations, not just in London, but elsewhere as well in cities. And of course, that brought a strain to the infrastructure. So we see by the early 18th century, London had grown to become the largest city in Europe. It had a population that passed 500,000 in the 1740s. And that amounted to about 10% of the entire population of Great Britain. In fact, this chart kind of shows you London's population swelled in size. It was like about 630,000 shortly before the Georgian period started, about, close to 1714. And it went up to over 3 million by 1860, just after our time period ends. So again, the Industrial Revolution turned London into one of the first megacities in the world, and London started swallowing up several parishes around it and areas that had once been farmland. But even despite this growth, London still only covered about 10,000 acres at this point. So you could still walk from one end to the other in an hour or two, depending how fast you walked. And as we're going to see, particularly next week, industrialization created great wealth in the city, but it also led to great poverty. And we'll be talking more about the poverty next week. There was high unemployment, overcrowding, crime. These were huge problems. Again, not just in London, but other big cities in the UK and elsewhere. Okay, what I want to do now is talk about society, some things that happen in London society during this time. And I mentioned that food and drink were really important industries in Georgian London. So I want to look at the role of drink in London society at this time. And we're going to start with the coffee house. Coffee came to England via Turkey and the Middle East. And the first coffee houses, actually the very first one, I think in London, opened in the middle of the 17th century. Took a while to catch on. It took a while for people to kind of catch on to this concept. But by the time we get to the early 1700s, there were hundreds of coffee houses across the city. And these were seen kind of as an alternative to ale houses and taverns, because at this time, coffee was really celebrated for its health benefits. It was thought to have very stimulating properties for the brain, as caffeine after all. Unlike wine or ale, it was believed that you could drink coffee in great abundance without any ill effects, without suffering any ill effects. I think there's a slightly different view on that today, but at the time it was seen as very healthy for you. It was believed to be a cure for headaches, for gout, for skin conditions. And in fact, some painkillers like Excedrin, I think they're still selling Excedrin, that has caffeine in it. So it's still kind of a proven that painkillers work better when there's a little bit of caffeine included in them. So these coffee houses, well, each one had a kind of slightly different personality. Some attracted the fashionable set. Some attracted scholars, some attracted working men, and some attracted scientists. So they're all a little bit different. A lot of them also doubled as gambling dens, barbershops. Some were even doubling as brothels at this time. And at least in the beginning, they were informal and they were very affordable. However, women were not allowed in. They could not attend. And people kind of had their own local favorite, kind of like a pub, going to your local pub. They each had their kind of favorites. And Samuel Pepys, who we talked about, the diarist, I mentioned him earlier. He mentions in his diaries, that he had a local coffee house that he went to. And they became a place where people socialized, where they debated issues, they gossiped, even business was transacted here. And also, interestingly enough, also during this time that the coffee house culture was taking off, the coffee houses were taking off, we also saw a rise in newspapers. So coffee houses became very busy centers for printed news. And and information sharing. It came to place to talk, read the news and talk about the news. And in fact, they even had boys called publication runners. And these boys were employed by the newspapers. And what they would do is they would run from coffee house to coffee house, spreading important news flashes. So kind of like breaking news. But it was news that was so fresh, it hadn't even been printed in the papers yet. So they would run in and exclaim the breaking news of the day. The proprietors of the coffee houses saw this as a good thing, saw this, newspaper business as a good thing. So they actually supplied newspapers and print books free of charge to their customers because they wanted to discourage this kind of debate and discussion, this kind of intellectual back and forth. Now, as I said, initially they started out informal, affordable. They were noted for their democratic nature. So you could walk into a place and they might have their own flavor, but you could see everybody sitting alongside each other. So a working class person sitting right alongside a leading intellectual, actively engaging in debate. And you would sit there and you would talk to not only your friends, but strangers. You would just get into all these various discussions. But by the late 1700s, the kind of socially mixed character that these coffee houses had, that had totally vanished. It changed dramatically. Many coffee houses had become very exclusive in character. They only opened their doors to the upper classes, to the clientele who could afford at this point to pay a subscription fee. So exactly why this happened, we're not exactly sure, but part of it was, as we'll see, the coffee houses started declining not too long after this for various reasons that we'll discuss. But also, I think the proprietors saw a way to make money. These were popular places, and why not hit up the well-heeled for this? So when we get to the end of the 1700s, 1700s, the popularity of coffee houses really had declined dramatically, in part because tea became very popular. Tea was very popular. So that became kind of taking over things. And also, newspapers were now really inexpensive. You could go buy your own newspaper. You didn't have to go to the coffee shop to get the newspaper, to read the newspaper for free. Very easy to do. So you could sit at home, and you could make your own coffee if you wanted to, or have your cup of tea and read your newspaper at home. And there were other social attractions. So there were other places to go out and meet people besides taverns and coffee houses. So you weren't drawn quite the same way as before. And what happened were these, as I said, they had become exclusive kind of clubs. And eventually they did morph into private and exclusive gentlemen's clubs, which didn't necessarily have anything to do with coffee. And some of them still exist to this day. Right near St. James Palace that we looked at last week is White's. White's is an exclusive members-only club. And it is actually where the now King Charles, when he was Prince of Wales, had his bachelor party before marrying Lady Diana Spencer in 1981. Okay. Along with coffee and tea, another drink that was actually taking hold at this time period was gin. And how did this come about? Well, in 1689, there was an act of parliament and it banned the import of French wine and spirits. They didn't want to bring the French wine in anymore. So at the same time, the government said, okay, in order to, offset this, we are going to encourage the distillation of spirits here in the UK, in Great Britain, made from indigenous crops, made from botanicals and crops right here in England and Great Britain. And what resulted was a very affordable native alternative to French brandy. And it was very, very cheap. And because it was cheap, it was consumed in really high quantities, especially among the poor. Cheap drink. And this really started concerning the more well-to-do in society because they saw all of this drinking going on and people getting drunk with gin on cheap gin. And they regarded this was the reason, this kind of gin craze, as they called it, was the reason for the sharp increase in disorder, crime, and even infant mortality in London. And at one point, not all that long ago, a historian actually equated the gin craze during this time. He compared it to the abuse of crack cocaine in inner cities today. It was a real big problem, a huge societal problem. So a campaign was undertaken. It was backed by the novelist Henry Fielding, among others, and it resulted in the Gin Act of 1751. And what this did was it prohibited gin distillers from selling to unlicensed merchants. So in other words, you couldn't just set up a little thing on the side out of your home and sell gin to people. You had to be a licensed merchant. And that also got rid of these small little gin shops. So basically, they restricted the distribution of gin to larger distillers and retailers, and that kind of helped curb the epidemic that was going on at this time. And William Hogarth, whom I'm sure some of you are familiar with, he was a painter and engraver. He created Gin Lane, which we're going to look at in a minute, to add some visual rhetoric to this campaign about the evils of gin and how they had to curb this. So here is Gin Lane. It's one of his very famous pieces of work. So this is St. Giles Rookery, a very densely populated slum with cheap housing and tenements. The destitute lived here, prostitutes lived here, criminals lived here. It was a very well-known, notorious area of London at this time. And what he has depicted here, as you can see in the foreground here, there's a baby falling off of its mother's lap, and the mother is disheveled, and she's got sores on her leg. It looks like she's got snuff there. You've got a very skeletal man, probably dead. He looks dead, down here in the right-hand corner. Another one being dumped into a wheelbarrow, a mother putting gin down her baby's throat. You've got people fighting over here. You've got houses kind of falling apart, looking all disheveled and falling apart. Someone being put in a coffin. I particularly like this guy chewing on a bone while the dog is chewing on the same bone that he is. So showing society really falling apart in this area. But interestingly enough, the opponents of gin were not opposed to drinking in general. And in fact, beer was still a very popular drink in London. So as a companion piece to Gin Lane, Hogarth created this, Beer Street. And if you compare the two of these pieces, you'll see that Beer Street displays a more respectable behavior as opposed to the depiction in Gin Lane. So people here look healthy, they look happy, they look prosperous. You know, buildings are being built, and there's a little bit boarding up here, but buildings are being built. People are drinking, they're heavy, they look like they're well fed, they look really happy. Now today, it's interesting because gin has had a resurgence in London. There are craft gins, just like there are craft beers. It's very popular again. And there's actually a place called the City of London Distillery in the City of London. And it offers what's called a gin lab. So you can go in there and you can learn the science of distilling and using different botanicals to make gin. You can design your own recipe. You can distill your very own personalized bottle of gin if you want to. You can make a label and everything. So you can walk out the door with your own bottle of gin. All right. But since we're looking at Beer Street, I do want to talk about this very weird accident called the beer flood of 1814. The St. Giles area, again, where we saw Gin Lane. This was the site of a very bizarre industrial accident. It started at the Horseshoe Brewery. The brewery had a 22-foot high wooden fermentation vat. They had a bunch of these in the courtyard outside the brewery. And they had these massive iron rings around them. And each of these vats held over 3,500 barrels of beer. And on October 17th, 1814, one of the iron rings around the tank snapped. And about an hour later, the entire tank ruptured. So basically, it was releasing this hot fermenting ale, and it did it with such force that the back wall of the brewery was knocked out. It collapsed under the weight of this. And the force also blasted open several more vats. So now you've got just tons of gallons of beer in the streets. Basically, it swept the streets up into this kind of 15-foot high tsunami of beer and debris. It flooded the basement of two houses. One of them they were having a wake at, and it killed, the house collapsed. It killed the mourners, a couple of the mourners in the wake. It also took out the wall of a nearby pub, so it trapped a teenage barmaid in the rubble. And in all, 8 people were killed. It was a very bizarre accident. Now, all this free, in quotes, beer was flowing in the streets. This led to hundreds of people scooping up the liquid, whatever containers they could find, anything they could find. They were trying to get all this free beer. Some resorted to just drinking it on the spot. So you got all this chaos going on with debris and bricks and wood and stuff flying around. And people at the same time are trying to grab all the beer they can get. Supposedly, there was a ninth victim of this beer flood, a man who died of alcohol poisoning a few days later from drinking so much free beer. We don't know if that's true or not. We do know that the brewery was taken to court over the accident, but the disaster was ruled an act of God, so no one was held responsible. This is a contemporary etching at the time, and you can see people drowning in the water, drowning in the beer. One guy still holding up his beer stein here. I really like the dog kind of surfing on a piece of driftwood here as he goes along. So very strange, very strange. All right, now let's move on to another topic. I mentioned that shopping was a big deal during this time period because you've got this burgeoning merchant class, and they've got disposable income, and they want to shop again for goods beyond the bare necessities. And you've got a lot of goods coming in from around the world as well. So this is a time when we started seeing an explosion of shops and shopping during this period. Some of London's oldest existing shops that are still around today, they were established during this time period. Fortnum and Mason's, which you see here, that was established in 1707, so just before our time period. Hatchard's, which is one of my favorite bookstores in the world, they were established in 1797. Flora's, which was a shop that sold perfumes, that's still around. That was established in 1730. And Hamley's, a famous toy shop in London, dates to 1760. But I want to show you this gem, if you're not aware of it. Today, it's an upscale wine store called Berry Brother and Rudd's wine shop. It's just a few steps away from St. James's Palace, where we were last week. But originally, it opened as a grocer's in 1698. And by 1760, the grocer started supplying George III and his court with food. And again, a lot of them were, they were housed. The court was at St. James's Palace, so right down the street. And then a few years later, the grocers, they had these weighing scales, of course, and they began using those scales to weigh the shop's many notable customers. So they've got these registers that you can look at when you go in there. And they've written down the person's name and how much, when they came in to get weighed and how much they weighed. You have royal princes getting weighed. Lord Byron got weighed in here, and even the Aga Khan. So you can go in and you can see, this is still really solidly Georgian. You can see the outside of the building. Nothing has changed. It's very Georgian on the outside. It's very Georgian on the inside. And you can go in and see all of this. So here's the inside. Supposedly you can still weigh yourself in here. I would not trust these ropes. I did not try it when I was in there, but here are the weights. So you can see that you can get weighed. And then over here, they started keeping the registers, or at least they've got them dating from 1765. And there they are there on the wall. And they've got some history of the wine shop on the wall. It is very upscale. It's a very expensive wine shop, but they do a house red and a house white, which are very, very reasonable and I think quite drinkable. So it's worth popping in there. It's quite an interesting shop. And then another place that I really like is Twining's Tea. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this name. This dates back to 1706, again, just before our time period today. It's the oldest tea shop in London. It's on its original site to this day, like Berry Brother and Rudd's. And I love the mosaic that they have as you go in there. They have a multitude of different types of tea. They have tea tastings. And in the very back, they've got a small historical display, kind of interesting to look at. It's a very long, narrow shop. I could not get a good picture of it because, again, it's in the original space and it was pretty crowded. Whenever I go in there, it's always crowded. But very long, narrow shop. And in the back, again, they've got this little historical display. And here's one of the packets of cocoa. Well, I don't know if it's coffee, tea, or cocoa, but anyway, one packet of something dating back, again, still in the original place that it was. So a lot of shopping and a lot of shops that are still around today, a few that are still around today, date from this time period. And now let's talk about this phenomena. The 18th century was the age of commercialized leisure. This was a term that was penned by historian Sir John Plumb. And this again was due to this growth of an urban middle class and rising incomes. So people were more willing to pay for entertainment. Again, other places to get entertainment other than going to a coffee house. So you started seeing paid for entertainment kind of showing up all over the place. And one of the most significant innovations was the pleasure garden. This was a dedicated outdoor space for entertainment. And in London, one of the biggest ones was Vauxhall Gardens near Lambeth on the south side of the river. And also there was a big one in Chelsea. Those are the two biggest ones. And then there were smaller ones scattered around other areas of London and on the outskirts. But basically what these were sites for music, for dancing, for eating and drinking. They'd have fireworks going off. They'd have operas, masquerade balls, illuminations. And you can see this is Vauxhall. You can see that they're kind of laid out as formal gardens. So they had these shrubberies and little miniature waterways running through here, dedicated buildings for performances and dedicated buildings for eating, little supper rooms. And you could go here, you could see the latest in art and architecture. So if you went to Vauxhall, you could see paintings by William Hogarth in the supper booths. So if you went in to have your supper in one of these little booths, Hogarth's paintings would be on the wall. So in some ways, they became the first public art gallery, if you will, in Britain. But I do want to talk about Vauxhall. This was originally known as New Spring Gardens. It was believed to have opened before the restoration in 1660. So this dates back to the Stuarts. And we know this because Samuel Pepys mentioned it in his diaries in 1662. It consisted of several acres of trees and shrubs with attractive walkways. And initially you could get in for free. How did they keep it running if they let people in for free? Well, you would pay for food and drink when you were there, and they assumed you would do that. But much of its success, much of Vauxhall's success was owed to a guy named Jonathan Tyers. He was an impresario and he took over the management in 1728. Now, even though it was free to get in, over time, just like the coffee houses kind of morphed, pleasure gardens really were aimed at the wealthy, the aristocratic, the more prosperous sort of merchants and professional families. So you would go here to be seen and to see people. You would go here to see how are people dressed. I want people to see how I'm dressed. You'd wear your best clothes. But there were also people of a, shall we say, more dubious character coming in. So prostitutes frequented the gardens, particularly when the admission was still free. They would come in and pick up clients there. So because of this, in 1732, Tyers relaunched Vauxhall. He had this really well-advertised cleanup campaign. He started charging admission to keep the riffraff out. And he started introducing strolling Methodist ministers who would walk around the gardens and talk to people. And he saw this as a way to keep the number of prostitutes down. But he wasn't all that successful because, you know, these gardens had hidden little groves and alleyways of trees, and the prostitutes could, you know, sneak down there, especially the well-dressed prostitutes. Some of these prostitutes, these sex workers, made very good money depending on their clientele. And so they were still getting in there one way or the other. But central to all of these, you know, I talked about the art and the fireworks and the masquerades, and you can see people dancing here with the orchestras. Central to the entertainment really was the musical performances. So Handel became kind of a composer in residence here in the 1730s and 40s. And in fact, in 1749, his music for the royal fireworks was rehearsed at Vauxhall Gardens. And so many people wanted to come over and see this. About 12,000 of them were said to have been making their way over to the gardens, that this central arch of the newly built London Bridge collapsed and caused a 3-hour basically traffic jam, with people trying to get over to this gardens. And then over in Chelsea, the garden there, in June of 1765, 9-year-old Mozart entertained the public with some of his own keyboard compositions over in Chelsea. Vauxhall also saw the reenactment of the Battle of Waterloo in 1817 with 1,000 soldiers participating. But then over time, the garden changed hands many times. It opened and closed frequently. And then in 1859, it was finally shut down for good. This 12-acre site was sold to a developer. And it was really the end of an era that was never ever seen or repeated again. And in fact, such was the loss of this London institution that one journalist, I think maybe being a bit dramatic, he wrote that the loss of the gardens was like the sale of the pyramids or the last water going over Niagara Falls. But we've never seen anything since, before or since, quite like these pleasure gardens. I would say the closest modern equivalent I've seen, if you've been to Copenhagen, Tivoli Gardens in Copenhagen, they have lights and they have like all kinds of shows and things going on. That's the closest equivalent that I can think of today. So in the 40s and 50s, what happened after Vauxhall closed down? Well, when we move on to the 1940s and 50s, it became social housing, but these houses were demolished in the 1970s. And today, there is an open air park and garden here. Doesn't look anything like Vauxhall Gardens looked in the day, but they do use it for concerts, for movie viewings, and for other events like these guys here who seem to be doing some kind of a relay race on these bouncy, big balloony things. So it does bring out a crowd, and it is being used today, which is kind of nice to see. Okay, let's now talk about civil engineering. This time period saw the destruction of sections of that London Wall that had been around since the Roman period. So Bishopsgate, Cripplegate, Ludgate, these were all taken down during this time period in the around 1760 or so. And we saw the city beginning to pave streets in Westminster and in the city of London. We also saw improved roads leading into the city. So basically, a coach ride from Edinburgh that would have taken 2 weeks, they got it all the way down to 2 days, which was pretty incredible between 1780 and 18. The fourth, his favorite designer, John Nash, he developed the broad avenues of Regent Street and Piccadilly Circus. And we started seeing Regent's Park and other royal parks cropping up and opening to the public. And as I said, we also had the pleasure gardens at this time. And bridges. I'm not going to say a lot about London Bridge because I know Peter's going to talk about that in a couple of weeks. But the heavily congested London Bridge was the only dry crossing over the Thames downriver of Kingston. So basically the only one in London. And as the western suburbs grew in size, increasing numbers of people were inconvenienced by having to cross the river by ferries. So in 1736, a new act was passed to make a bridge, construct a bridge between Westminster and Lambeth. And it was the first to be built in London since the 13th century, since the London Bridge had been rebuilt. Originally, it was proposed to be built in 1664, or they proposed it in 1664. But at that time, there was a real pushback from the watermen. Remember, I talked about those little ferries, those that went wherries and went back and forth across the river all day. They opposed it because they said, look, if we lose first of all, we're going to lose our jobs, which is not good for us. And secondly, we often get recruited to join the Royal Navy. And if England has to go to war again, where are you going to get your sea men from? So they put it off for quite a while. But when the new bridge finally received royal approval, the watermen received a very generous compensation for being displaced, equivalent to about $2.5 million today. So they did okay. So the bridge, and I think the one here is showing it kind of under construction. This new bridge, it spanned 1,223 feet of the river. It was 44 feet in width, so really wide pavements. You could have 3 carriages abreast on this bridge, so not like the old London Bridge. And it featured these turrets at intervals along the bridge here. And these were, you can kind of see one here, these were designed to give shelter to pedestrians if you were walking in the rain, that kind of thing. But unfortunately, they proved to be good hiding places for muggers who would jump out and accost the pedestrians. So consequently, 12 night watchmen were hired to guard the travelers as they crossed the bridge at night. Now, this is not the bridge, the current Westminster Bridge. That one dates to 1862. But this was a big development to have a new bridge across here. I mentioned roads a minute ago. Until the middle of the 18th century, it was necessary to pass through London in order to pass from one side to the other. There was no way to skirt your way around it, and very congested streets. So going from Kensington in the west to Whitechapel in the east, it was a very time-consuming affair. So petitions were made to Parliament. They wanted to create a bypass to the north of London, and they did enact legislation in 1756 to create the new road that ran from Paddington to Angel Inn at Islington. So from this, we got Marylebone Road, Euston Road, and the Pentonville Road today. So they kind of skirted around, tried to get people away from having to go straight across London. And then streetlights was another innovation that came in. From the mid-18th century to the early 19th century, this was a major innovation brought about because of the Industrial Revolution. Now, oil lamps had been being used for a while, but then you got this guy named William Murdoch, and he developed a system using coal gas to light his factories. And using these led to eventually to coal gas street lamps being installed in London. The first ones were installed in 1807. And then Parliament went ahead and gave the London and Westminster Gaslight and Coke Company, which was the first gas company in the world, a charter to light London's streets in 1812. So you started seeing more of these. So by the end of 1813, Westminster Bridge was the first in the city to be lit by gas. There are still 1,500 of these lights in use today, these gas lamps in use today in London. And they have 5 British gas engineers who work as lamp lighters. And on the left here, you can see, this is not my photo, this is from Getty Images, but you can see one of these men at work lighting the lamps. And then on the right was one I took one night walking back home. And it was very Sherlock Holmesy that night. It was very kind of foggy and misty, and these were all lit going down along near Westminster Abbey and near the Houses of Parliament. Railways, as I said earlier, made a huge, major impact on the city of on London, on not just the 1 square mile, but the city. In fact, it didn't hit the 1 square mile. They didn't want the railways in there. Now, early in the 19th century, London was really still a walking city. So as I said, you could go from one end to the other, from east to west in a couple of hours, 1 or 2 hours, depending on how quickly you could walk. And a lot of people lived close to or even over their workplace because working hours were long, wages were low, and there was no cheap mass travel at this time. So if you had money, if you were an aristocrat, you had private carriages. If you were the gentry or a well-off merchant, you could afford hackney carriages, which were like taxi cabs. And if you were the middle class, you rode on horse-drawn omnibuses. But the working class people continued to walk. Now, we get to the early part of the 19th century, and this really was the golden age of steam. And the first real railway line that opened in London was on December of 1836, and it ran from London Bridge out to Greenwich. And after that, we saw a huge railway boom. There were 5 major stations built across London between 1837 and 1850. And this was to meet the demand of this growing number of workers some of whom were living in the suburbs, the ones that had a little more money and could afford to live out in the suburbs, but needed to come into London to work. And the early railways, especially to the south and east in London, they catered for this kind of short distance traffic to bring in people from the suburbs. But over time, we started seeing new terminals being built for long distance lines. So Euston, for instance, in 1837, and Paddington, these were more stations that went out further afield. So they didn't have a big impact on kind of mass transit within the urban area itself. Their fares were really high. They didn't cater for short distance commuters. They were more interested in the long distance traveler. But to get back to how this affected London in terms of an urban center, the building of these railways actually added to urban congestion rather than easing it. You know, so the thought was, okay, you've got some of these workers going out now into the suburbs to live. This is a good thing. So we'll bring them in by rail. It'll ease congestion, but it didn't. Because think about it. You've got the railway tracks, you've got the railway stations, you've got the goods yards and associated buildings. So there was always a railway hotel. There were offices that were attached to the railways. They had to take up a considerable amount of urban land. And the railway companies actually became among the largest urban landlords, or landowners rather, in London. And what did they do? They took land, they went and bought land from the cheap working class slum housing areas because the well-heeled did not want their properties torn down, you know, and they didn't want rail lines going through. The working class had no say in any of this, obviously. And the railways made the argument, first of all, it was cheaper for them, obviously, to buy up this land than it was to buy up land in more fashionable parts of London. But also the railways made a claim, you know, we're doing a good thing for society because we're clearing out unhealthy, overcrowded areas. Now, one historian estimated that 76,000 people were displaced between 1853 and 1901 by these railway schemes. And because these people were mostly poor and they worked very long hours for lower wages, they could not afford the time or the money to not live very close to where they were working. Remember, they were still walking places. So basically, when their existing dwellings were demolished, they moved to any nearby accommodation they could find, and all it did was it worsened the overcrowding. And we'll talk again more about that next week when we get into the Victorian era, but really made things much, much worse for these people. Now, speaking of railways today, London Bridge is the oldest surviving station still in operation in London. And I mentioned building works. This was a time of great building work. So we were seeing new hospitals and churches and museums and neighborhoods cropping up and even royal palaces. Hospitals, 4 new general hospitals were founded in London between 1720 and 1745. So Westminster, which is now the Chelsea Westminster Hospital, still one of the best hospitals in London. That was founded in 1720. Westminster consolidated in 1992 to make the Chelsea Westminster Hospital. Guy's was founded in 1721, and that's now affiliated with King's College, London. St. George's, 1733, they consolidated with the University of London. Middlesex was founded in 1745. And then Moorfields came later. That didn't come until 1804. But these all began as charity hospitals, and they went on to become really great institutions. And in several cases, the architects gave their services for free. They didn't charge anything to build these hospitals, and they ended up serving on the board of governors. A lot of them did, of these hospitals. Now, Middlesex, this was a teaching hospital. It closed in 2005, so it's the only one on this list not in existence today. But I want you to remember that name because we're going to come back to that next week. Moorfields was founded in 1804, as I said, and it was the first hospital in the world devoted to the treatment of eye disease. Because at the beginning of the 19th century, ophthalmology was pretty much an unknown science. Nobody was really treating it well at that time. But this all changed because you had a lot of soldiers coming back from the Napoleonic Wars, and they were suffering from a very virulent, serious bacterial eye infection. So with this epidemic kind of as the impetus, the hospital was founded. The current hospital, it's still ongoing. It moved to its present location in 1899, and it's still a leading center and hospital for research, study, and treatment of medical issues related to ophthalmology. So still very, very well known. Churches. I have a whole 4-week course on London churches, if you're interested. In 1710, after they'd been out of power for 22 years, the Tory party got back into power. They were big supporters of the Church of England, and they were not happy with this rise of nonconformist Protestantism that they saw going on in London. So the following year, they passed the 50 New Churches Act of 1711, and they said, we want to build 50 new Anglican churches in and around London. Now, this was enacted partially They said to fulfill the spiritual need of London's burgeoning population, because the population was going way up. But it was mainly to cement the authority of the Church of England against Catholicism and popular nonconformist sects. And they even said, and I quote, this was to, quote, bring religion to the godless masses of London. So, and they also said, kind of related to all of this in this act, that all 50 churches had to have tall spires. And the idea was they were going to tower above these nonconformist chapels and churches. Two very prominent architects of their generation, Nicholas Hawksmoor and James Gibb, they acted as the surveyors responsible for overseeing the building works. And along with Christopher Wren, these two men created some of London's finest churches. Unfortunately for the Tories, 5 years after they got into power, they were out again. Enthusiasm for this 50 Churches Act waned, and only 12 churches were ever completed. 6 of them, Hawksmoor's churches, survive, despite having been bombed in World War II. And you can see a list of them here. And again, I talk about some of these in the church course. And here's one of them. This is Christ Church, Spitalfields. It was designed and built by Hawksmoor between 1714 and 1729. It cost 4 times over its initial budget. And again, it had this huge spire that would kind of loom over the Huguenots who were in the area at Spitalfields at that time, the nonconformist Huguenots. This is not the original spire. The steeple was replaced in the 19th century. It's an interesting place to go into. This is one of the shots from inside. It was falling to pieces. And again, I discussed this in the other course, but has been kind of saved and restored. It was close to getting torn down at one point. And museums, I wanted to talk about the British Museum. This was founded in 1753, and this was as a result of an act of Parliament called, aptly enough, the British Museum Act. It was the first national public museum in the world, and its initial acquisitions actually consisted of purchased collections of the first and second Earls of Oxford, the collections of a politician named Sir Robert Bruce Cotton and his son and grandson, but most famously of Sir Hans Sloane. He was a physician, a scientist, a very avid collector, and he amassed over 80,000 natural rarities, 40,000 books and manuscripts, and 30,000 coins. And then the collection was further added onto by medieval manuscripts that were donated to the library by George II. And when it opened its doors, so it opened its doors in 1759 finally, you had to apply for a ticket to see the collection. It was only open limited hours. So really only the well-to-do had access to the museum. And basically, if you were lucky enough, you kind of got a private tour of the collections at this time. Not like how big it is today, obviously. It was originally housed in Montague House, which was a 17th century mansion, but it quickly outgrew that space. So the mansion was demolished, and this new building that we see today, this was erected in 1723. And about the same time the new building opened, the museum became more accessible. So it had longer opening hours. It was easier for people to get in and see the collections. And today it has over 8 million items covering 2 million years of human history. And it also has a somewhat controversial history. Some of its acquisitions were seen to have been stolen or sneakily taken out of countries, including the Elgin marbles, which is still an ongoing debate that's going on. And most recently, they were in the news unfavorably because someone working, an employee of the museum, managed to, over the years, steal a great number of items and sell them. And these were items that were in storerooms in the museum, and the museum hadn't cataloged them. They hadn't put any acquisition numbers on them, so they don't even know exactly what disappeared. Again, I also have a course on museums, London museums and monuments, and we go into a lot more detail about the British Museum and other museums in that course. But this was a grand one that opened in this time period. And then during the final 25 years of the 17th century, London was spreading westward. We started seeing more buildings coming up, more housing coming up, upscale terraced housing, what we call row housing here, a real trademark of Georgian architecture. Lots of examples in London: Grosvenor Square, Hanover Square, Cavendish Square. And we also saw the creation of this time of Bloomsbury, St. James, Soho, Piccadilly, Marylebone. So lots of these neighborhoods and areas, residential areas, were growing up at this time. But what I really love, one of my favorite places in London, it's not to everyone's taste, but I absolutely love it, is Spitalfields. This is an area of London that few tourists know about or visit. And it has, I think, a fascinating history. It's been inhabited since the Roman times. It was outside the city walls at this time, so relatively rural. And in fact, it was home to a very large Roman burial ground, because remember, I told you the Romans always buried their dead outside the city walls. It has some of the finest early Georgian architecture in London. So when we think of Georgian, we often think of, if I go back here, this, right? Or Jane Austen, Bath, if you've gone to Bath, that kind of thing. This stuff is the real deal for early Georgian architecture. If you really want to see the early stuff, go to Spitalfields. It attracted a lot of immigrants and nonconformists, including those Huguenot silk weavers that I mentioned, because it was free from trade regulations and restrictions that were imposed by the guilds of when we talked about those medieval guilds and the livery companies. And so it was outside that city structure, so they didn't have those restrictions on them. And even today, Spitalfields has a very thriving immigrant community, and we come back and visit Spitalfields in the last week of the course when we talk about immigration today. But it was an interesting place. So one of the first references we have to it occurred in the late 1300s. It was then known as Spittleland, Spittlelond. And then in the 16th century, it became Spittle, spelled with two L's, two T's, Spittle, one word, and Fields, a separate word. This probably derived from a priory and hospital in the area that you see here, St. Mary's Spittle. St. Mary's Spittle was built in the 1190s. It was one of the most significant hospitals in the country, and it was, a priory. But of course, our friend Henry VIII came along, and when he dissolved the monasteries, this priory was dissolved as well. After which time, this area started seeing the beginning of residential development, because some of these monastic houses were converted into private dwellings. Remember, Henry sold off, or mostly sold off, he didn't really give much away, to favored individuals. So he sold off a lot of this property. But I want to talk about the Huguenots, because you heard me mention them. They were French Protestants, and in the 16th and 17th centuries, they followed the teachings of the theologian John Calvin. I'm not going to get into that. I'm not a religious historian. Religion, that's not my thing. But we know that the French Calvinists adopted the Huguenot name around 1560. The first church, though, was actually earlier than this. The first church was created 5 years before that in a private home in Paris. We're not quite sure the origin of the name Huguenot. We think it may have derived from combining phrases in German and Flemish that describe the practice of home worship. They worshiped in their homes. We do know that by 1562, there were 2 million Huguenots in France, and they had over 2,000 churches. And they had the right to practice their religion, but they were not permitted to practice within towns, and they were not permitted to practice at night, and they could not bear arms. They couldn't be armed. Now, in 1562, there were 300 Huguenots holding a religious service in a barn outside of a village called Vassy, France, and they were attacked by troops. And more than 60 were killed, over 100 were wounded. And this led to something called the French Wars of Religion, and you saw a lot of Protestants and Catholics on both sides being killed. But the worst violence against the Huguenots was the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, which took place in 1572. This saw the murder of up to 70,000 Huguenots across France. And this was by the order of Catherine de' Medici. She was acting as regent for her underage son, King Charles IX, at this time. So this was a major massacre. But even before these widespread persecutions, Edward VI, who was the son of Henry VIII, the teenage king there, Edward VI, He granted a charter allowing for the first French Protestant church to be established in England, and it was established on Threadneedle Street in the city of London. It was later destroyed in the Great Fire of London, so we don't have it anymore. And then when we get to the reign of James II, that Catholic who was kicked off the throne, James was sympathetic enough to the cause. Many new French churches were founded basically to deal with this influx of French Protestants that were coming in. So quite a few in London and in the suburbs. Because it was during this time that Louis XIV was on the throne in France, and it was estimated that about out of the 200,000 to 250,000 Huguenots who fled France, about 40,000 to 50,000 ended up in England. And by the late 1760s, over 25,000 Huguenot refugees and their descendants lived in Greater London alone. So quite a large body. In fact, today, it's estimated that 1 in 6 Britons has some Huguenot blood in them. And as an aside, George Washington was the great-great-great-grandson of a Huguenot. So we come back to Spitalfields. There's over 300 Huguenot families settling in Spitalfields. Most of them were silk weavers, and they set up flourishing businesses. They became known as the center for silk weaving excellence. But they were also very well known for their watch and clock making. And if you go to the British Museum and the Museum of London today, you can see some of their work in those museums. Here's a French Protestant church today in London on Soho Square, and over the doorway, I blew this picture up so you can see it over the doorway. This is in remembrance of the royal charter that was granted in 1550. So you can see the Huguenots on the left here in the boats, fleeing France, coming to England, and then the king here granting them the charter. But as I said, Spitalfields has some of the best preserved Georgian architecture in the city. And walking down its streets, if the cars weren't there, if some of the modern art and graffiti weren't on some of the walls, it really is like stepping back in time. And they've done quite a good job. They're still under threat in some places in Spitalfields, but they've done a really good job of trying to retain the flavor and the original buildings of this period. And I just love walking around here taking photos. So here are some of the photos. And you can see this is 5 and 5A. You see this around here because these great merchant houses later on, when Spitalfields fell on harder times, the houses were split. They were divided up. But just amazing, beautiful architecture. And again, 11 and 11 and a half, because you can see where the building was split up. If you go to Spitalfields and you want to see how a Huguenot silk weaver would have lived, you can visit Dennis Sieber's house. It's in Folgate Street. It's on one of your handouts. He was a local character in Spitalfields, and visiting the house is quite an experience. This is Dennis on the left here. He was actually an American who came to England went to England when he was only, I think, 18, or right out of college, I think, high school or college, I don't remember which, and lived there ever since. So he bought this house, and he wanted to restore it to look like one of the weavers' houses. But it's very interesting. You go in, touring it is quite an experience. There's no talking. You cannot talk while you're in there. There's no lighting, no artificial lighting. And you walk through the rooms, and it kind of looks like a family just got up and walked out of there. So there's half-eaten pretend food, obviously not real food, sitting on the tables. There's half-made beds. There's papers, an open newspaper. It's very interesting. Very, very interesting. So Dennis, yeah, he opened his house to visitors. He hosted tours for almost 20 years. He died in 1999, but shortly before doing so, he knew he was very ill. He sold his house to the Spitalfields Trust, and they maintain it to this day. And one of the really interesting things is the way it reflects the changing nature and fortunes of this house in Spitalfields, because it moved from being an affluent merchant's house to being crowded and decayed. Spitalfields fell on hard times when we get to the Victorian period. So by the 19th century, most of the area's traditional industries, including silk weaving, had moved elsewhere, and Spitalfields really became quite poverty-stricken. So you have these grand houses that the Huguenots had built, but they became slums. The area became very dangerous. By the late 19th century, it was kind of a no-go zone. Nobody wanted to go there. And even 20 years ago, it was still sketchy, maybe even 15 years ago. Now it's getting more gentrified. These houses are horrifically expensive to buy now. It's become more upscale, although it still kind of retains that kind of scruffy feeling, which is why I say it's not always for everybody. It's not pretty. It's very interesting, but it's not chocolate box pretty. But these are some pictures inside. You couldn't take pictures, so these are professional photos from someone else. And you see, you start out with these beautiful, elegant rooms from the time period. Very lovely. But then as you go on, they start getting a little simpler. This is a great example of someone just walked out. Here's someone's glasses sitting here with a half-open book. Here's a punch bowl, a glass. There's some half-eaten food. But then as you go up and up and up the stairs, each time period unveils itself. So now we're getting to the Victorian era, when it was really becoming more of a slum area, when they could not keep the house up, peeling paint. In fact, when I got to the top story of the house, I had to turn around and come right back down because I have asthma and it was so moldy. I don't know how the ceiling hasn't fallen in, but they've kept it as it was. But well worth a visit. It's very, very interesting to visit if you're there. All right, now I mentioned palaces, and that's what I want to end on, a couple of palaces. Throughout London's history, the monarch had many residents in and out of London, including St. James's Palace, which we talked about last week. But in the 18th century, the acquisition of Buckingham House by George III, he bought it in 1761, that began the move toward what would ultimately become the monarch's official London residence, Buckingham Palace. The land sits in Westminster. We talked about Westminster before when we talked about Westminster Palace and the Westminster Abbey and the monastery that was there. And back in the first Stuart king's time, James I, he built some gardens here, kind of attached to St. James's Palace. And he had a small 4-acre grove of mulberry trees because he was really interested in silk production, and silkworms only feed on mulberry trees. Unfortunately, James did not do enough research on this because he planted the wrong type of mulberry trees. So his silkworm venture flopped. Over time, some of this land was given to, sold off or given to different nobles. So we do know in 1698, this property, the land, was sold to a man named John Sheffield. There was an original house on this property. He decided it was outdated. He tore it down. In the early 1700s, he built a house known as Buckingham House, and he named it that because he was the Duke of Buckingham. John Sheffield was the Duke of Buckingham, so he named it after his title. And you can see the early depiction, one of the early depictions here. It was widely, when it was completed, it was thought to be one of the fanciest houses in London. Sheffield died in 1721. At one point, the house was briefly considered as a site for the British Museum. Remember, I said they were outgrowing space where they were in Montague House, but they wanted so much money for it. It was an exorbitant amount of money, and so the British Museum said, thanks, but no thanks. So George III bought the house in 1761, and he spent over $20 million in today's money renovating the structure. And his plan was he wanted to use this as a house for his wife and his children. So after they moved in, and they didn't move in permanently, again, the children lived there more than George. George didn't really live there. It became known as the Queen's House because he had it built for his wife or renovated for his wife. He dies in 1820. His son, George IV, comes to the throne. George was already considered relatively old at that time. He was 60 years old, and he was not in great health, but he had grown up at Buckingham House, and so he was very fond of it, and he decided, I want to make this the official royal residence. And he hired John Nash, that guy I talked about a little earlier, who created Regent Street. He hired him to expand and renovate this and make it into an actual real official royal residence. This is Nash's plan. You see it's this U-shaped structure. He was facing it with stone from quarries near Bath. He expanded the main section of the buildings. He added west wings and branches to the north and south. He rebuilt the east wings. Had this huge courtyard. And Nash built this triumphal arch made of Italian marble for the courtyard. And it depicted Britain's recent military victories at that time. So any visiting dignitaries who were coming into the palace, the idea was if they came into the palace to visit the monarch, they would have to go through this imposing entrance that was basically showing off the military victories of Britain. Now, his work on the new palace was very well received, and it's still considered an architectural masterpiece today. But George IV, as I said, he was relatively old and not in great health. He died in 1830. And at that time, the British government said, okay, we're putting a halt to this. And the reason was it was just too expensive. It was costing British taxpayers an inordinate amount of money for this. And they said, no, we're not interested. Plus, George V's brother, the last Georgian king, the last Hanoverian king, was the only non-George, a guy named William IV, and he was not interested in living here. He wanted to stay where he was before. He was a more simple guy. He didn't have a fancy coronation. He had no interest in this. So they kind of let it sit for quite a while. Finally, and in fact, at one point, actually, next week we'll talk about the Houses of Parliament. They were destroyed by a fire in the 1830s. William IV said to Parliament, to the government, here, take Buckingham, Buckingham Palace, you can have it. And Parliament said, no, we don't want it. So it kind of became this white elephant. But finally, in the early 1830s, 1833, 1834, Parliament voted, okay, let's complete the furnishing and interior and refurbishment of Buckingham Palace, and it will be the official royal residence. William dies in 1837, and he is succeeded by his niece, Victoria, Queen Victoria. She became the first permanent residence of Buckingham Palace. And soon after taking up residence, she said, you know something, this place isn't big enough for me. I can't entertain all my foreign dignitaries here. So Nash comes back in 1845. He encloses, no, he didn't come in, sorry. Someone else came in, but the forecourt that you see here, this kind of open courtyard, that was enclosed on the eastern side to put in more staterooms and ballrooms and things. And that arch, that triumphal arch that was sitting here, was moved to nearby Hyde Park Corner and is now known as Marble Arch. So Marble Arch started its life at Buckingham Palace. Here's the floor plan. You can see over time how things were added and changed. And the gates were not completed until 1911. Very nice gates here. And then some other work was done on it right before the First World War. Now, today, it is the administrative headquarters of the royal family. It's the site of many official events and receptions. You can tour it now. You didn't used to be able to, but they opened it up for tours, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago. I think after the Windsor fire, the Windsor Castle fire, and they wanted to raise some money for the restoration of Windsor, so they opened it up for tours. 830,000 square feet, 775 rooms, 19 staterooms, 52 royal and guest bedrooms, 188 staff bedrooms, 92 offices, and 78 bathrooms. But none of the monarchs are officially living here. The Queen quit living here quite some time ago. She favored Windsor, the late Queen favored Windsor over Buckingham Palace. And King Charles is still living at Clarence House, which is where he was living as Prince of Wales, the latter part of his life as Prince of Wales. So he doesn't seem to have any interest in moving in here either. And then the very last one I want to mention very quickly is Kensington Palace. This was once a small and suburban villa. It was known as Nottingham House. William III and Mary II, you remember William and Mary being the daughter of James II, William and Mary, who came over and kicked James II off the throne during the Glorious Revolution. They decided they wanted to buy this villa. They bought it in 1689. It was a modest place. They wanted it as their country retreat because London had then, as has had before and since, not great air quality, and William had asthma. So he wanted a place where there was fresher air. This was out in the country at this time. So they bought it, and over the years, this has been transformed. The Stuarts and the Georgians really transformed this into a very fashionable home. Queen Caroline, who was the wife of George II, she really shaped up the palace and the gardens. And as I said, Queen Victoria ended up in Buckingham Palace when she became queen, but she spent her childhood here. She was here until she became queen. So Kensington also became the home for minor royals, including Victoria's daughter, who was a very talented sculptor, Princess Louise. And you can see here in 1893, she created this marble sculpture of her mother. This is in the grounds of Kensington Palace, and it depicts her mother, Queen Victoria, as an 18-year-old in her coronation robes. If we move on to more recent times in the 1980s and 1990s, royal residents at that time included the then Prince and Princess of Wales, Charles and Diana, the late Queen Elizabeth II's sister, Princess Margaret, lived here, and then you'd have assorted minor royals who had apartments. And also there were what they called grace and favor apartments, where people who had worked for the royal family could live for free. Prince Charles, the then Prince Charles, actually referred to Kensington Palace at one point as the ant heap, because so many of his aged aunts lived at the palace. And today, it's one of the 3 official homes of the current Prince and Princess of Wales, William and Catherine. I would say before we get on to next week, if you haven't been to Kensington Palace, there are areas open to the public. You can walk through the King's State apartments, the Queen's State apartments. They're open year round. The gardens are very beautiful. They have a very nice place to have afternoon tea. And they also have special exhibits going on all the time. So if you haven't been, I would recommend going. So this week, with the exception of the gin craze and the beer flood, we focused on how the Industrial Revolution transformed London. We saw this growing middle class, people who had money for the first time to spend on leisure activities like shopping and going to pleasure gardens. We saw the growth of hospitals, the continued development of civil engineering, streetlights, railways, better road systems. But as I mentioned before, the Industrial Revolution did cause a lot of social problems. So next week, we're going to be talking about Victorian London, and we're going to examine how London grappled with the challenges of increasing poverty, overcrowded housing conditions, disease, crime, and the less than ideal labor practices, including child labor, that really led to dangerous working conditions. So that's all coming up next week. And I will stop sharing my screen and I will look at my chat. Let's see what we have in the chat here. Yes, there was a pawnbroker. Good catch, Peter. Yes, there was a pawnbroker in the Beer Street picture. How did they find the royal coffins? Peter asks. They're renovating right now in that area because they're putting up new luxury apartments. So they started doing some renovations in that area as far back as the 1990s. They were doing some excavation work, but this was because they're putting up new luxury apartments. And, London, like Rome and a lot of other places, whenever you dig, you got to have the archaeologists there because you're more likely than not, you are sure to hit something. And in this case, they were very excited, especially about this bed. Well, and the coffins too, because the coffins, like I said, they'd only found, I think, 2 or 3 before this. So very, very unusual.
Well, my question really, Deb, is these are wooden.
Yeah, yeah.
If you're digging with a backhoe, or a huge excavator, they wouldn't present any resistance. Do they X-ray the ground or sonogram the ground?
I think they do. I think they do sonogramming, particularly around, again, depending on where they are excavating. If they are excavating, like I said, in the 90s, they found some Roman remains there. And not remains of people. I forgot what they found, but they found some evidence there. And they know whenever they go digging around London, they have these very detailed maps and they have to consult with the archaeologists because they know that there are certain areas, particularly within the city of London, because that was where all the Romans were, obviously, that there's a high chance that they're going to hit something, that they might very well run into something. So they have to be extremely vigilant and careful about how they approach this. So they have maps of where past things were found. And I'm sure they do some type of sonogram or x-ray, whatever, to ensure, to see if they see anything. And they also they're much more careful. They're not going to go into a place where they know that there was a Roman cemetery where they have found evidence in the past. They're not going to go in with a big backhoe and just start digging up tons of land. And the archaeologists have to be on site for these excavations. So they work hand in hand. It's not just that the company comes in and starts digging everything up willy-nilly. Now, if they're further afield, it depends, you know. But again, there were Romans all over, you know, many parts of Britain. So if they know that there is evidence, past evidence, either from archaeological finds or just from historic documents, they have to proceed with great, great caution how they do this. So yeah, that's how they don't get destroyed. They do really have lamp lighters that still go around, just a handful, like I said, 5 who are still employed, who go around and turn on the pilot lights and then turn them off in the morning. So yeah, there are still a few around. I don't know that they do all 1,500 of those lights. I'm not sure if some of them have been mechanized or how they've been mechanized, but yeah, they still do have 5 in employment who go around and do this. Kind of hard to get rid of tradition, I guess. Other questions or comments?
Well, with regard to the pawnbroker in the beer picture, was that to sort of indicate that while beer drinking was better than gin, that it still drove the drinkers into debt?
You know something, I think, let me look. I'm going to go back for a minute here on my slides because there was a pawnbroker. Let's go back to Gin Lane. Let me share this again because I actually think, let me go back and share my screen. I think, where are we? Yeah, here we go. The pawnbroker was up here. This was Gin Lane.
Yeah, but you go to the next one and there's a pawnbroker on the right.
Oh,
There
yeah, you're right. Yeah. So I guess, yeah,
There's pawnbroker, and you can see
yeah,
the sign almost falling down.
yeah, yeah. So I
So
suppose
it's
the idea was it's still, you know, you could still, yeah, yeah.
there's
Beer was considered okay, but yeah, I suppose maybe this guy snuck over from Gin Lane and decided to try his hand with beer instead. That is a good point. Yeah. Not
It's
sure.
interesting also of that one on the left, you see a sign painter
Yep.
painting the sign, which is still standard outside British pubs.
Oh, yeah, definitely, definitely. Yeah. But in this case, him painting that sign is actually a sign of prosperity because, you know, they can keep up stuff. They've got fancy, you know, they've got a nice sign. The pub is going to be nice. It's not all falling to pieces. But your point about the pawnbroker is a good one because this is a very dilapidated building. Even his 3 balls there are beginning to fall down. The sign of the pawnbroker, the symbol of the
Cracks in the
pawnbroker.
building.
Yeah,
And you
yeah,
notice you notice that side of the picture, the right side of the picture, is darker.
Good point. Yeah, yeah, it is. It is. So maybe that was the transition from, although this guy looks quite happy and rather chubby. He looks-
And if that guy is drinking gin, he's dead.
oh,
So,
no, no, I don't. That's a Stein. I mean, not a Stein.
yeah,
But
I know.
yeah.
I'm
Yeah, he
kind of
would
joking
be,
on playing on the dark
he
aspect
would
of
be
it.
like this guy here. He would be,
Yeah.
already be out of it. But, yeah, no, good point. Good point. Other observations or comments or questions? Guess I can also turn my video back on here. Okay. Well, if there's nothing else, I got you in just on time. Just in time. I didn't go over this time, and I even put in the little Roman stuff. I wanted to make sure I talked about those latest Roman findings because every day there's something I have to revise on these lectures because
Deb,
yep.
have you ever done tours of London? I mean, conducted tours of London?
I'm
Oh,
laughing. I'm laughing because Peter suggested we do a Love Living at Home tour of London that I lead.
Yeah.
I have not. I have not. Lifelong brought it up at one point, not officially. One of the program directors at the time, unfortunately, Lifelong seems to go through program directors rather frequently, like once a year. They seem to have a new program director. But I don't know, 3 program directors ago, maybe, before that person left. She had said, because they do tours, they do tours. And she said,
Yeah.
we should see if we can do a tour of London and have you lead the tour of London. And I said, yeah, propose something, put something together. And then she left and, it kind of fell to the wayside. It's interesting you say that though, for 2 reasons, because Peter did just bring this up a couple of weeks ago. And he said, you should do one for Love Living at Home. Several years ago, a colleague of mine, or really a friend of mine, I didn't work right alongside him, obviously, at the School of Industrial and Labor Relations at Cornell. He's an economic historian and a big Anglophile and knows London, like I know London. And we came up with a proposal for the Cornell Adult University, but they shot it down because they didn't want 2 of us. They didn't want to pay for 2 of us, basically. And we wanted to do a joint tour. And we wanted to focus, even though it's not my time period per se, it's more his time period. We wanted to focus on poverty in London and the economic changes in London in the Georgian and Victorian period. And we were both really big on Spitalfields and we talked to the Bishopsgate Institute. I think he even contacted them to see if we could use them to use the classroom space there. And then I would go out, we would go out and tour them around various places and we would do this together. But Cornell Adult University said, no, we only want to pay for 1 of you. We can't really pay for 2 of you. The woman even said, would you mind sharing a hotel room? I'm like, yeah, we would. And she went as far as to say, well, you could put like a string and a blanket over the string, like in the movie It Happened One Night. We're like, yeah, no, that's not happening.
Yeah, we're going to charge each participant $10,000.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
But
So they were, and this was a long time ago, but they're like, yeah, no, we're not paying for both of you. And we said, yeah, no, we're not sharing a room. We're not paying our own way. One of us is not paying our own way.
Well,